ask the question, what is the address of your heart? That if our address of our heart is God, then we will chase His dreams for us, and being discipled means that we trust those dreams. See, salvation is trusting Him with our death. Being discipled and growing into who He's called us to be, now that is trusting all these dreams that He has for us. Michael, when he was leading worship last week, he just kind of offhandedly said this phrase, I think people would trust God more if they understood who He was. He actually said, if we understood how much He loved us. And that got me thinking about how possibly people see God and how we can adjust that perception. Sometimes the best way to describe who someone's like or what someone's like is to describe to you what He's not like. Okay, so here's 4 of what God's not like. First is that God isn't a disinterested bystander in your life. He's not a disinterested bystander. The Bible describes God as knowing how many hairs are on our heads. It says that He thinks of us more than the sands of the sea daily. That He knows all of our days before they were ever lived out. They were written in His book. Does that sound like a disinterested bystander? It doesn't. Those two things don't coincide. He's also not an interested spectator. He didn't just kind of buy a ticket to the show. Wishes us well, but for the most part, you're on your own. Now, I love how David goes before God in Psalm 17, 6 and 8, that I think really counteracts that idea that he's just an interested spectator. David says, I call on you, my God, for you will answer me. Turn your ear to me and hear my prayer. Show me the wonders of your great love, you who save by your right hand those who take refuge in you from their foes. Keep me as the apple of your eye. Hide me in the shadow of your wings. That does not describe just an interested spectator, how David approached God. He's also not a drone pilot. He doesn't just maneuver a joystick, pushes a few buttons to get us to do exactly what He wants us to do when He wants us to do it. And then this one, you'd have to be a Hunger Games watcher or reader for this one, but I've read all 3 books and watched all the movies, and some of you have already prejudged me and think that was an awful thing to watch, but that's okay. And it was that He isn't the gamekeeper. And so in the movie, there is a person who just kind of constructs all this kind of false reality to drive people in certain places. And God isn't up there just pulling strings and pushing buttons, but He is a very involved God, a loving, trustworthy God, involved very intimately. In fact, Scripture says that He became flesh. That the Bible actually fleshes out a God who is so personal that He comes to us directly. Then in the Gospel of John, it's even said that Jesus became flesh and moved into the neighborhood, as one version says. Another says that He pitched His tent among us. All of them fleshing out this idea that God lived and dwelled among us. That is an interested, intimately involved God, even emotionally connected to us. All that to say that we can trust Him with our dreams. We're going to talk today about 4 Old Testament figures because we're going to look at the low points in their dream. So last week was dream alignment. I want to talk about dream process, dream fulfillment. What's the process of how God's dreams in our life get fulfilled? And the reason why I want to focus on the low points in these stories is because if you've been in church or you've read the Bible, you know, on some of these stories, I'm going to tell you these are old stories. So you might already know the high points. But isn't it interesting that when we already know a conclusion to a story, we have a way of dismissing all the hardship that leads up to the conclusion? You know it, you can give assent to it, but the gut-wrenching nature of it, you kind of just forget. There's a phrase that I hear used a lot, it's a God thing. And usually what people means when they say it's a God thing is this thing worked out and these dots connected and this good thing happened. I have never heard anybody say when they totaled their car it was a God thing. Or when there's been long gaps of time between when God may have made a promise to you and before it was redeemed, and you said, oh, well, this long gap is a God thing. See, God things aren't just the things that we think turn out nice. There's a process involved in dreams being fulfilled, and all of it becomes what God and how God operates. So we're going to look at the 4 low points of these characters. First is Noah. Noah, the high point of Noah's story is Noah is chosen by God to build an ark. The low point of Noah's story is that Noah was chosen to build an ark. I mean, think about it. The size and scope of what God is asking was unfathomable. I think right after you get asked to build an ark when you don't even have any idea what it is the question, what's an ark? You know, why me and what's an ark? I mean, there were boats at the time, but there was no rain and there was therefore no idea of flood. And he wasn't building a boat. The thing wasn't built to navigate or to fish off of. It was just built to float. Understand the size and scope of this thing. The way Scripture outlines it, it would be longer than a football field and a half. It would be wider than a football field plus another half width of a football field. So it was about 75 yards wide. And then it was 4 stories high. I mean, I don't know about you, but my mind goes to immediately, how am I going to pay for that? Right? How is it possible that I'm going to secure enough resources to be able to build that? And then, my questions go, and how long is that going to take? Now, we have no idea how long it took to build the ark. We only have 2 times that are mentioned in this story. One, Noah was 500 years old when he had his boys. And then it says when he was 600, the flood came. Now, I don't know if it took 100 years to build the ark, but here's what I do know. I've lived here for 10 years, and still there's construction going on between Cool Springs and up to 840 on I-65, right? And they've had every imaginable amount of money and resources and people to build this road, and it's still not done yet. How long did it take to build the ark? I have no idea. But you know this had to be an arduous process with Noah. What made Noah the person that God would tap to build this ark, this dream? Well, look in Genesis chapter 6, 5 through 9, and we learn a little bit more about the circumstances, and we learn a little bit about who Noah is. So the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I've created, and with the animals and the birds and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I've made them. And then here comes a great preposition, but. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And this is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people for his time, and he walked faithfully with God. And here becomes part of that initial dream process is walking faithfully with God. When no one around you is walking faithfully to anything but themselves. This was an evil time. It would have been easy for Noah to just get folded in with the rest of humanity, but yet he stood out because he walked faithfully with God. And then in Hebrews 11:7, we find out how he was able to build this ark. Hebrews 11:7 says, by faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir to righteousness that comes by faith. And here we go. The first process, I think, the dream process that happens is that we have to have crazy faith. What am I mean crazy faith? Well, it was a crazy ask. I mean, it was. An ark is a crazy ask. And so the only way you can handle a crazy ask is with crazy faith. See, I'm talking about 4 people today. Just forgive me if I get them all jumbled up. Noah had to come to the conclusion that it wasn't going to be out of his resources that this was going to be done. When God calls you to something, when God gives you a dream, rarely do you ever have the resources or experience in order to carry that thing out when he gives you the dream. And most of the time then when you get the dream like that, you just kind of, well, okay, I'm out. And because we assess what we've got, and then we put it up against what's being asked, and when those 2 things don't coincide, when they don't equal out, we're out. But Noah teaches us about this dream process that when God calls and drops a dream, rarely do we have, if ever, have any of the resources that's going to be necessary to carry that out. Why? Because he doesn't want us to carry it out. He wants us to follow him. His first call was always follow me. It wasn't lead me anywhere. It wasn't do this. It was follow me. So here's how I've worded the first thing in this process, this dream process. So to live the dream, it takes crazy faith in God and not faith in ourselves. And that's kind of an anti-American statement. Faith in God, crazy faith in God, not faith in ourselves. Here's the second one. The second one we're going to talk about, Abraham. Abraham is chosen by God, not unlike Noah is chosen by God. That in the midst of all the people, he chooses Abraham to begin this nation that was going to be identified by his name. This takes some crazy faith too, but in Genesis 12, this crazy faith gets connected to a really mega promise. And that's also what I found when he drops crazy dreams, is the promises are so big. Here's what it says. God promises Abraham, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. And Abraham says, I'm in. And Abraham leaves. He was asked to leave his country, to leave his family, and to go into a land that God had not told him where. There was no GPS, ain't no atlas going on here. I will lead you. You follow me, I will lead you. Will you go? And Abraham says, yes. Well, then we fast forward to chapter 15, and there still isn't any children in the midst. And so after this, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in verse 1 of chapter 15. Do not be afraid, Abraham. And boy, that just tucked right in there is an important thing for you to grasp. It's easy to become afraid following after the dreams God puts in your life. Fear can easily crop up. And if you want a little exercise, have some fun, go on BibleGateway.com or something and start and look for fear not. It's amazing how many times God enters a picture with an angel or himself, and his first words are, fear not, or don't be afraid. Why? Because I'm your shield and your very great reward. And here's a very important part of this dream process, that the dream is never the end. The dream isn't the reward. God is the reward. Now, this is important because if the dream's our reward, then we're only going to feel fulfilled and satisfied and complete when the dream is complete. But if God is our reward, that's what he's teaching him. I'm your refuge, I'm your protection, and I'm your reward. When you get me, you always get everything. Okay? And so then he goes on a little further. Verse 3, Abram said, you've given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. And then the word of the Lord came to him and said, this man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said, so shall your offspring be. Abraham believed God. This is a huge phrase, even mentioned in Hebrews. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, that his faith really represented his own salvation. But then, not only does Abraham teach us this idea of that God is a reward, not the dream, he emphasizes this again in Genesis 22. In Genesis 22, kind of a high point of Abraham's story here is that God asks him to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah. And the high point of the story is that God stops that from happening and provides a ram. The low point of that story is, can you imagine the walk up the mountain with your son, probably your teenage son? And he turns to you and says, Dad, I see the fire, I see the wood, I don't see the sacrifice. And as a dad, Abraham says this, God will provide. So Abraham is walking up facing the very death of his dream, but still believing that God will provide. And in Genesis 22, 12 through 18, it plays out like this. He has Isaac bound on the altar with all of that emotion. And as he's about to sacrifice Isaac, God steps in. Don't lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself," this is kind of what I read even out of Hebrews at the end of worship. "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you've done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, as the sand of the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of cities and their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." Multiple times, God is reaffirming this dream to Abraham. And here's the second part. I've learned that the dream process will always involve a dream altar. The dream altar is a way in which God ensures that He's still the reward we're after. Later on in Hebrews, it says Abraham was looking for a city whose architect and builder was the Lord. Abraham was always looking for God as his reward. And so many times we have to lay dreams on altars to ensure that God's the reward and not the dream. And then I've used it another way. You're slugging through, you're having a hard time trying to make something work. You believe it's something God has asked you to do or He's put in your life to do, and it's just not working out like you thought. There's been multiple times in my life I said, "Well, you know what, Lord? I've given this everything that I have to give. It's not going anywhere. I'm going to put it right here on the altar. And if you want to raise that thing back up, you raise it back up, and I'll run with it. If not, listen, so many times we keep things alive much longer than they should be alive in our life. We keep them on life support, and God's saying, "Look, it's just sucking life out of you. That's never been my dream." But when it's His dream, He raises it back up. And one of the big points we talked about last week is that when God resurrects something in our life, it has more life after the resurrection than it ever did in its life prior to its death. That's what we have to trust. I think that's part of what Abraham teaches us about this dream process. So here's how I worded that one. To live the dream, it takes a willingness to lay down the dream, realizing that God is our reward and not the dream. All right, let's fast forward to Joseph. Joseph is Abraham's great-grandson. His dream starts with dreams. He literally has two dreams. The first dream he has is that these sheaves of grain, of wheat, his sheaves stand up and all his brother's sheaves bow down to him. How many know the brothers weren't all excited about that dream? And he has another dream. He dreamed that the sun and moon and all the stars bow down to his star. And that represented his mom and dad. They weren't all that excited about his dream either. But it says that his father Jacob pondered these things in his heart, wondering if there might be something to this. Joseph's story to me is a good news, bad news story. Good news, bad news. Good news, he's favored by his dad, unlike any of his other brothers. Bad news, brothers aren't very keen to that, and they throw him in a cistern and they plan on killing him. That's the bad news. The good news is they don't kill him, but the bad news is they sell him into slavery with a caravan heading to Egypt. But the good news is the person who buys them is of high standing and authority in Egypt. The bad news is that man's wife kind of took a liking to Joseph and made a couple passes at him, and when he did not reciprocate, she cried foul, claimed that he had sexually assaulted her, and he's thrown in jail. That's the bad news. The good news is while he's in jail, he gains the favor of the jailer and ends up running the whole jail. That's the good news. The bad news is two men who promised when they left prison to remind the Pharaoh that he was there, didn't. The good news is Pharaoh has a dream and can't interpret it. And one of those prisoners remembers, hey, wait a minute, there was a guy we met in prison that can. And Joseph interprets the dream that there's going to be a great famine in the land. And then Pharaoh makes him in charge, prisoner, now in charge of the whole nation, all their resources. And here's when in this process, when Joseph was a boy and God gives two dreams of his brothers bowing down and all these stars, when in part of this good news, bad news story do you say, God, I'm out? I'm done with this. How many different times do I have to ride on this roller coaster? How many times is it going to be good news and then bad news and good news, bad news? I'm out. And one of the things that I really think God wants to teach us about how we follow his dreams is we need some grit in our life. Some spiritual grit. That we truly trust what he said or what he's shown, even when things aren't just working out like we think they ought to work out. Because God has a bigger picture. We see things in slides. He sees things in movies. We see pictures. He sees it as one big drama. And then here's what happens. Famine does hit. It's scarce. And his family, who thinks he's dead, now make their way to Egypt in order to gain some food. And in that, they have to come before Joseph, and Joseph recognizes his family. He's able to save his family. But after Jacob dies, Joseph's dad, the brothers are so afraid. And they come before him, and they're pleading for their life. And then Joseph says this. This is an iconic verse of Scripture. He said, what you meant for my harm, my evil, God intended it for the salvation of many. You know, wow. See, the grit is to walk through the hardest of hard times when you're following after God's dream for your life, because the end result of this is going to be for the salvation of many. See, Joseph could have used his position. If you are a person of position or authority, you have two choices. You can use your position or your authority for your benefit, or you can use it for the salvation of many. What are you going to do with it? And Joseph teaches us that even when we get to the end of this dream and this reward, it's not just for us. Your life and my life may never be recorded like Noah and Abraham and Joseph. But still, God's dream for all of us is at the end of this, we have played a role for the salvation of many. Is that worth walking through the bad news part of the good news story? It will be. I phrased the third dream process to this. To live the dream, it takes grit to walk through adversity, and to keep the dream about God and not about us. A realignment of the dream again. Here's the last one. I know I've covered most of the Old Testament. Actually not, just pretty much Genesis. Pretty big book though. So we got the crazy faith of Noah. We got the dream altar of Abraham, and that God is our reward. The grit of Joseph, and let's look at, I think, a very significant part of Moses' story that gets overlooked. It's recorded in Hebrews 11, 24 through 26. It says, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking for his reward. I don't know if you could describe someone of more privilege than Moses would have been. The greatest nation, the most powerful nation, the son of the most powerful man in all of the world, growing up in the opulence of the palace with every single thing at his fingertips. And then he gets to the age and he recognizes, I am not an Egyptian, I'm a Hebrew. But now look at the juxtaposition of these two worlds. I have Hebrews that are being slaves, and I've got everything I want at my fingertips. And he made the choice to be associated with the Hebrews than the Egyptians. And what I find a lot of times is that we want to live out God's dream, but we get stuck between these two worlds. And a lot of the consternation that you're going through trying to chase after God's dreams is you're trying to hold on to both sides at the same time. And it's not possible. You hear me? It's just not even, it's not possible, because both are pulling in opposite poles. And so it goes back to Matthew 6, where the address of our heart is where our treasure is. And we can't have treasure in both places and survive. He made a choice. He had to turn his back on everything that would have been everybody's dream to follow after God. Look, 40 years, though, after that decision, still nothing. Scripture says that he was in the desert. The desert, in and of itself, sounds like a remote place, doesn't it? I mean, it does for Middle Tennesseans, at least. You're from Arizona, it might not sound that way. It might sound like good golf courses to you. I don't know. But desert. But look, Scripture doesn't even say he's in the desert. He said he was on the backside of the desert. So like he was even more remote than a remote place is. Why? Here's what I think. I think it took 40 years. I think it took God 40 years to get the palace out of Moses. 40 years for Moses to come to the end of himself, so that when God speaks to him again and says, I want you to go and deliver my people, Moses is saying, I think you got the wrong person. See, 40 years before, he said, tap me. 40 years later, he's like, God, I'm empty. I got nothing left. I am not the guy you want for this. And God said, oh yeah, you're the exact guy I want for this. Why? Because 40 years ago, you had a choice, and you chose correctly. You walked faithfully. And I know that the 40 years have felt lonely and felt like that you've quit or been crushed, but no. Look, even these 40 years have played into my dream for you. See, that's a low point, isn't it? It's hard to embrace low points in dreams. We want the high points of dreams. I understand, but don't you believe that if you can understand that there's a process that God does in us, doesn't that make it, maybe easier is not the right word, but doesn't it make it that you can walk it out? If you can understand there's a process that goes on in our life and in the lives of others, that we can pursue the dreams of God, even when the process is not easy. Why? Because the end always turns out for the salvation of many. We are the only delivery source God ever designed for this message of grace. You and me, the church, we are it. This is his plan. He had no plan B. And when we chase after, when we make primarily our life about chasing stuff here, this stuff doesn't last. It is not the place for our main address of our heart. I like things too. I am like everybody else in the world. And what I've realized is that when I chase after God, he backfills all that other stuff. But when I chase after that stuff, I never get him. Maybe measured in doses, but what is it like to have him as our reward? What could that be like? Hey, Abraham, I am your shield, and I am your great reward. Me, Abraham. Not the dream, not anything you ever would have thought. Here's how I phrased this last process. And Benji or Jenny, you guys can come up. Is that it takes, to live the dream, it takes choosing God over temptation and valuing that when we come to the end of ourselves, we are at the beginning of God. That when we come to the end of ourselves, we're at the beginning of God. I wonder where you are in this kind of process of dreaming. One of the things that came into my heart as I prayed for people at the 10 o'clock service is that something I used to tell students when I was a student pastor in the 90s, that don't doubt the darkness, what God shows you in the light. The darkness are the low points, the things that doesn't seem to make any sense to how this could possibly add up to a dream God has inside of you. Well, the best thing that God does is resurrections. And one of the best descriptions of God is he calls things that are not as if they were. That's our God. And so wherever you are in this process, whether a dream needs to die and you need to lay it down to see if God raises it back up, if you got to realign your heart to Him being the heart and the reward. I mean, wherever you are in this process, I'm wondering if anybody has ever come alongside of you as a part of the dream process. Has anybody ever put a hand on your shoulder and prayed for you as you walk through this process? See, I want to be a place that comes alongside of people with dreams. And I believe one of the main ways the enemy tries to combat us is to isolate us. And one of the antidote to isolation is being a part of a church. Pastor Michael, when he leads worship a lot, he'll tell us that he asks us to raise our hands, right? And he says that why? He says because our heart follows our hands. And it occurred to me this week that our heart also follows our feet. Why would we come up out of a seat and walk forward in a building in front of people we don't know? Well, it's because our heart follows our feet. And that we make a step in faith asking God to speak to us at an altar. And altars are where God speaks to us. It's not the only place God speaks to us. But God speaks to us in altars. And I'm going to give you a chance today because I want other people to be able to come behind you, some of our elders and staff, to put a hand on your shoulder and pray for you. You might feel like your dream is dead. But I hope today that God would infuse you with some crazy faith. I pray today that God would tell you that He is your reward. All the things that we talked about through these 4 lives to come to rest and set on your spirit. I want to pray, and then I want to invite you, if anyone wants to come and pray, that we can come behind you and pray for you in your dreams today. Father, I'm grateful that you are a resurrection God, that you resurrect in us. And I don't know where the state of anybody's dream is in this room. Lord, I don't know if you need to birth one, you need to align one, you need to resurrect one, but Lord, I know that you want to do something in our lives. And I pray that this time, in this moment, this holy moment, at the end of this service would be a time that you'd speak life and liberty in our hearts. As Benji and Jenna sing, I want to invite you, if you want someone to pray with you about what this process in your life, I want you to come forward now.
Head that once was crowned with thorns is crowned with glory now. The Savior knelt to wash our feet. Now at His feet we bow. The one who wore our sin and shame, now robed in majesty, the radiance of perfect love now shines for all to see. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Your name of victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. The fear that held us gives way to Him who is our peace. His final breath upon the cross is now alive in me. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Your name is victory. All the ashes of defeat. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. In your name I come alive to declare your victory. The resurrected King, stand with us and sing this. Resurrecting me. By your Spirit I will rise from the ashes of defeat. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. In your name I come alive to declare your victory. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. Yeah. He's resurrecting me. Yeah. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Yeah, your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Yeah, you are Christ our King. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. By your Spirit I will rise from the ashes of defeat. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. In your name I come alive to declare your victory. The resurrected King is resurrecting me.
It's hard to accept that death is a normal part of life. That we walk through stuff that dies in our life. But we should latch on to the second part of that. That death is a part of life, but life is always a part of Jesus. Really, nothing stays dead around Christ other than the things that should be dead and moved on. So this isn't just about God breathing life into something that should be dead and we move on from. Because in those times, God creates as well as He resurrects. Okay? So I've said a lot that the best thing God does is resurrections. But I would say He's got two specialties: resurrections and creations. He can create new life and new dreams and new purpose in you where you think the other one is dead, you know it's dead, but God hasn't birthed anything new yet. God can and He will do that. It's been great being with you today. We hope if you're a guest today that you are warmly welcomed. As mentioned, as Pastor Craig mentioned, we'd love to get a chance to meet you. I have a gift for you right outside these double doors. And if you've noticed, we got rid of announcements during service, right? And so that's always a good thing, bad thing. The good thing is it takes up too much time. But the bad news is that it's part of body life. And it's important to know, like baptism coming up in 2 weeks. We're going to do communion next week. There's a congregational meeting next Sunday night where we'll go over last year's kind of finances, get you open book, let you see all that kind of stuff. I mean, so it's important stuff you can always find on the website, gatewayfranklin.com/news. As always, all that information is on there. Now for a benediction. May the Lord bless you and keep you. may make his face to shine on you, be gracious to you, and grant you peace. And you're rising up, and you're laying down, and you're going out and coming in both now and forevermore. God bless you. Enjoy your Sunday afternoon.
Let the Spirit of the Lord come rushing in, rushing in, rushing in. Let the Spirit of the Lord come rushing in, rushing in. Come rushing in. There's a longing deep inside, and I can feel it. Only you can satisfy, only you can feel it. Just a moment in your presence makes me desperate for more. Oh, there's a longing deep inside, and I can feel it. Only you can satisfy, only you can feel it. Just a moment in your presence makes me desperate for more. I'm desperate for more. Let the Spirit of the Lord come rushing in, rushing in, rushing in. Let the Spirit of the Lord come rushing in, overwhelm my heart again. Let the Spirit of the Lord come rushing in, rushing in, rushing in. Come rushing in. There's a longing deep inside, and I can feel it. Only you can satisfy, only you can feel it. Just a moment in your presence makes me desperate for more. Desperate for more. Let the Spirit of the Lord come rushing in, rushing in, rushing in. Let the Spirit of the Lord come rushing in, overwhelm my heart again. Let the Spirit of the Lord come rushing in, rushing in, rushing in. Come rushing I wanna see you, feel you, hear you, Jesus, come and have your way. I wanna give you all of me, my heart and soul, my everything. I wanna see you, feel you, hear you, Jesus, come and have your way. I wanna give you all of me, my heart and soul, my everything. The Spirit of the Lord come rushing in, rushing in, rushing in. Let the Spirit of the Lord come rushing in, overwhelm my heart again. Let the Spirit of the Lord come rushing in, rushing in, rushing in.